G'day folks, and welcome to this series on board games and history. So often when we're playing board games, it's the historical theme within that game that grabs our attention, that draws us towards the title and the subject matter, and that most engages us with the game we're playing. Now, when I'm not playing games, I'm Associate Professor of Public and Applied History at the University of New England in Australia. And as part of what I do in that role, I reflect on the nature of history, of historical practice, historical representation, and the way history is presented to the public. Historical movies, for example, are often at the forefront of many of those discussions. Historical board games, less so, and I'd like to change that. Naturally, I think a lot about the way historical board games, war games in particular, draw on history, use history in their designs, and represent that history. And it begs the question, are historical board games a form of historical representation? Now, the first caveat I need to make is that tens of thousands of board games have been published over the years. The market is expanding and those publications come in many different forms. Some are very loosely associated with historical events. They may blend fantasy with a little bit of history, while others adhere very strictly to those historical events. Some of these games are what we might call light and easy. They use a historical setting, but they may lack accuracy and detail and divert very strictly from historical events. Others are what we might call heavy and complex, and they may strive for rigorous accuracy and detail. Now, almost immediately, I think opinions may be divided. Some of you may be thinking, well, of course, the Battle of Gettysburg actually happened. It's history. So a game on the Battle of Gettysburg is a form of historical representation of the battle. Others may be thinking, no, the moment you do something in a game that didn't actually happen, it's a break from history, and thus not accurate, not history. Or is it? I want to begin with a preamble. Don't worry, it won't be long. I want to first step back and consider what is history. And I want to start by distinguishing between history and the past. The past is everything that has ever happened, whether it was noteworthy or not, whether it was recorded and chronicled and described or not. That's all the past. History is our human representation of the past. It is our attempt to communicate specific information about aspects of the past to that audience. It is incomplete, it is fragmented, it is problematic, not least because it was created by humans and we're fallible. But the important thing here is that historical representations strive for an accurate understanding of the past based on the events as they actually happened. Wie es Englisch gewesen. Historical outputs are snapshots, glimpses into our past. Within that, we might consider two main types of history: scholarly history and public history. And I want to address scholarly history first. Scholarly history has a clear purpose, and that is to advance human knowledge about our past. To clarify, advance knowledge by discovering and sharing new information. It does so by strictly adhering to specific disciplinary methods and conventions. There are strict, both written and unwritten protocols in place for the dissemination of scholarly information. It is typically written, peer-reviewed, referenced, presented as an argument, and of course focused on new information and knowledge. So for these and other reasons, board games aren't scholarly history. Games may meet one or two of those requirements. They may be based on scholarly advances, but it has to generally meet all of them and more. But I want to make another point of clarification. You personally may gain new knowledge, and by playing through a game may model circumstances that enhance our understanding of the past. You might model the Battle of Gettysburg, adhere to historical events and decisions, and in the process determine something new about the battle, something we didn't know in the past. But unless you're sharing that information broadly with that scholarly historical community by adhering to the conventions of the discipline, it's not a contribution to broader historical knowledge, scholarly historical knowledge. So if you're wondering, yes, in a sense, scholarly historians very much serve as gatekeepers of new knowledge, determining what is accepted as new and important scholarly knowledge. But you might say, we're still representing history here. This is historically accurate, and in many cases, we're recreating historical events. That's true, but again, unless it's new knowledge making a new contribution to community knowledge, it's outside of that definition of scholarly history. But could it be a form of public history? Now, scholars have many varied definitions of what public history is. Many today argue that public history is history that is designed for public reception and public benefit. Some suggest that public history is practiced by members of the public. Personally, I like to think of public history as inclusive of everything outside of scholarly history. So if a representation, a historical representation, is not scholarly history, it's a form of public history, and that can be very broad and diverse. It also includes, of course, a lot of amateur, unpublished, underdeveloped, perhaps even poorly researched history, but it's still an attempt at history, however reliable or unreliable it may be. It's important to note here, though, that there's generally a different purpose to public history. Public history is not necessarily designed to enhance knowledge or expand our frontiers of understanding. Public history is typically designed to entertain and engage members of the public. It may have an educational element where it's designed to inform, but it will typically inform people by drawing on existing knowledge that is readily available, rather than that new scholarly knowledge. So if we think of historical knowledge, everything we know is a bubble. Scholarly history seeks to expand that bubble by discovering new information, adding to the bubble. Public history works within that bubble to typically repeat existing historical information, albeit in often new, exciting, innovative ways. Okay? Now, I emphasize new and exciting ways because public history doesn't adhere to those conventions of scholarly history. Public history can be bold, innovative, and exciting. It can be historical reenactments or recreations of historical sites and buildings. It can be interactive websites, audio histories, even the many YouTube histories you may watch. Importantly, there are elements of public history in board games, where board games convey historical information through flavoured text on cards and historical booklets, through historical events and so forth. They're conveying accurate, detailed historical information. History then, public history, is presented via those elements of those historical board games, elements of those board games. What about the games themselves and the actual act of playing through those historical board games? Well, if a game enables you to adhere strictly to past events or movements or actions, and you as a player stay on that line and make your moves such that you are perfectly aligning with those past events, then you've recreated or represented history as it actually happened. But that's rarely the case. In fact, game designers are often criticised if their game forces players to adhere to this history and, to use a common expression, stay on the rails of past events. There are, of course, many people who play games to experience that history, and for some, sticking to the rails of history and playing through that strict narrative-driven experience where the narrative adheres closely to historical events can be engaging and rewarding. Many others, though, play games to have agency and control, to interact with and change those historical settings and the course of events, to experiment with alternative approaches and situations. And whatever the game, the moment a player adds even a slight variation to past events, they've changed that past trajectory. They're outside the realm of the past as it actually happened, and they're into a new field, which we can call counterfactual history. Now, counterfactual history, also known as what if or alternate history, is an exercise in considering what might have happened in the past had events changed slightly. What if Napoleon didn't invade Russia? What if Operation Market Garden didn't go ahead? What if Robert E. Lee didn't attack at Gettysburg? And it's fascinating and fun to consider what might have happened counter to the facts, or counterfactually. And let me clarify, counterfactual history is often practiced by both scholarly and non-scholarly historians. Good, detailed counterfactual history requires an immense depth of knowledge on a subject. To make a case for what might have happened if Lee didn't attack at Gettysburg, a historian needs to know the details such as the broad operational and supply situation at the time, to be able to piece together the potential what-ifs, to know what might have happened if Napoleon focused more of his troops on Hougoumont. A historian needs to know the details such as what units were available, how strong were they, how would they move there, and how would the terrain affect their attack. With that knowledge, counterfactual historians provide that accurate infrastructure for their counterfactual histories. Many historical game designers often do much the same thing. They provide the rigorously researched and accurate infrastructure for counterfactual historical gaming. Many historical board game and wargame designers spend years, sometimes decades, researching their topic to create that accurate infrastructure. Some, and you can look at Ed Wimble from Clash of Arms Games in particular, know the movements, the mentality, and the health of various historical agents at various points in the past. And of course, that detailed knowledge is reflected in the detail of their design. That historical infrastructure includes some of those details that I mentioned, the nature of forces at your disposal, their location, their ability to move across different terrain, the effects of terrain on combat, and many other considerations. With that infrastructure in place, the game designer then allows players to explore their counterfactual history, the what-if scenarios of what might have happened, a break from the historical trajectory. Other historical gamers merely use that historical infrastructure loosely as a theme or background upon which they primarily focus on creating a fun game experience rather than an accurate or believable historical experience. As you're probably gathering, much of counterfactual historical writing is military themed. Likewise, most historical board games are war games, focused on war and military themes. But of course, that's not always the case. And again, I want to be inclusive and think about the use of history in historical board games generally. A historical board game like Freedom, the Underground Railroad, provides players with the infrastructure to learn about the escape of African Americans from the southern slave states to the northern free states in Canada. The recently published Gandhi, the decolonisation of British India, largely revolves around non-violent social action. In these and other cases, the designers have rigorously researched their subjects and provide an accurate historical infrastructure within which players can create counterfactual versions of historical events. So, are these historical board and war games a form of history? Well, they're a form of counterfactual history, a type of historically rooted fiction, much like a historical film or television series. They use an accurate, believable historical setting as their basis. They provide a framework or infrastructure for that believable historical narrative to evolve, but ultimately by facilitating an alternative narrative within that setting, they break from the past as it actually was and move into that alternative what-if counterfactual version of events. So is there value in counterfactual historical representation? How do different game designers approach their designs in different ways? And what about that broad spectrum of light to heavy, easy to complex games? Do they all count as counterfactual histories? Well, I'll talk more about those topics in future videos. For now, thanks for listening and feel free to leave a comment.